moving on from the lottery selection under 9B to item 9C to discuss recommendations by the superintendent on SPED actions, special education. Dr. McCormick.
Yes. In your packet, in yellow, you have a memo from me speaking to special education recommendations. I first explained to you that my first month here, I spent considerable time reviewing the report, talking with our administrative team, and the that's what I mean.
It's not mine. Nothing goes in when I got here.
Okay, I'd like to reconvene the meeting following our technology break for the video. If we could, we are now moving on from the lottery selection under 9B to item 9C to discuss recommendations by the superintendent on SPED actions, special education. Dr. McCormick.
Yes. In your packet, in yellow, you have a memo from me speaking to special education recommendations. I first explained to you that my first month here, I spent considerable time reviewing the report, talking with our administrative team and the special education case managers around and some of the folks in the central office. Also had the opportunity to discuss the report with Dr. Apuda and to be present at his presentation a little bit ago. For the sake of the audience that's here, I will read each of the recommendations and just make a very short comment relative to each one, and would then certainly open it up to questions or thoughts, Mr. Chairman, if you agree. The first, recruit and hire a full-time special education director. That would be for the July 1 start date. I really believe, and based on the input I received from both case managers and the administrative team, as well as people in the central office, in order for anything constructive and positive to happen, you need to have that person overseeing and leading the program. 2, develop and implement criteria used to assign paraprofessional support services to children with learning disabilities. Although there are things in place that guide the decision-making, I don't believe that they are implemented consistently. That's not just a belief, that is input that I received directly from the administrative team. And along that line, what we would be doing would be to develop benchmarks and time frame in students' individualized education plans to assist in the transition away from an individual need for paraprofessional support. Oftentimes in an IEP, we'll write in that the services of a paraprofessional, rather it be a one-on-one, a one-on-two, or a one-on-three, is written into an IEP, but we very seldomly include in the IEP the criteria by which we would transition away from that level of support. So we think that would be helpful. 3, improve the consistency with which eligibility criteria is used to identify children in need of special education services. This was indeed one of Dr. Apuda's concerns that he raised, the over-identification of students. And again, in talking with the administrative team in particular, they identified the fact that we do have criteria, but it could be used more consistently than what it has been. Develop process maps to assist in the identification of and placement in appropriate district programs. And basically what this is a flow chart of services and programs available to students who, for whatever reason, aren't performing at a specific level. So that the beauty of that is in presenting that to all staff, especially new staff coming in, they will know what programs and processes are available to deal with some of these special needs and learning differences of our students. Continue efforts to monitor out-of-district students' progress on a regular basis, and when appropriate, develop a transition plan to bring the student back to a less restrictive environment. And under that, what we would be doing is placing stronger requirements on regular progress report from program providers. I would comment that we are doing this now. We've started doing this. I can't say started doing it differently or better, other than there has been a renewed emphasis. And I would say that we have been, over the last month, in the process, either initiating at one level or another. And Ms. Freeman has been directly involved and very successful in indeed bringing youngsters back from the out-of-district placements, which is a more restrictive placement and is more costly. So we're looking to bring some of these students back. Investigate the feasibility of an alternative school within the district. That basically was in response to Dr. Apuda's thought of the number of students we're placing out of district, but it also was based on feedback from the administrative team, where this has been a thought that had been raised before. So this is not a new thought necessarily at this point. Conduct needs assessment of professional learning needs for certified and non-certified regular and special education staff. This is partially in response to Dr. Apuda's comments or recommendations relative to the amount of direct instruction provided by our by our special ed, as well, certified special ed staff, as well as non-certified paraprofessionals. Recruit and hire to the extent possible related service providers when it is cost effective to do so. Again, that was one of Dr. Apuda's recommendations, that we look to see what we could do relative to that. And I think the district had already been doing that and resorted to where we are now because they could not recruit, because there weren't that many of them, and or they chose another location or another district in which to work. Research best practices in relation to the inclusionary model of providing services to special needs students. I believe that when we had a focused monitoring study done, we were actually complimented for our efforts along the inclusionary model, which again is in compliance with the law. But we need to stay abreast of what are the best practices. Oddly enough, I mean, I think it's a case where, with respect to inclusion, my opinion, the pendulum swung where everyone had to be included in that model. I think they've moved a little bit away from that, but we just need to stay abreast of what does the research tell us is the most effective way to include identified students. Does it need to be more reflective of what we need to do to become compliant and efficient in what we do? I don't know as I sit here tonight. But then just make sure that that's in the hands of all the decision makers with respect to especially the development of IEPs and those involved in the referral process.
Can you explain what the alternative school is?
I think the thought there was, and I would ask Mr. O'Malley to speak to this because it was something that had, I think, been discussed to some level here at the secondary level. But basically, we have what I would consider to be a significant number of students placed out of district for certain types of programming. If we could look to replicating those types of services within district, meaning we would need space and staffing to do so, or possibly could join with other school districts. For example, I think Plymouth High School had a program, I know
Pemmy Baker Academy.
the Pemmy Baker Academy, but I believe that no longer exists. I mean, that might be something, and you could enter into some type of partnership with regional districts to have that happen. It would certainly be a different curriculum, different approach, different philosophy than you would see in a regular school setting.
And last, develop and implement the criteria used to assign paraprofessionals, and then you have conduct needs assessment for being certified and non-certified. It seems like both of those two tie together.
They're related in one sense, you're correct. The develop and implement criteria, I know in the district I was previously, this was something that we did. It causes staff, inclusive of your administrative members, to just step back and look at a certain group of guidelines that would be used ahead of time. And it just adds, I guess I'd like to say, it adds some quality control to that decision-making around whether or not we do or we do not hire paraprofessionals. I'll tell you that I was at a meeting within the last week. There was a situation where we're looking to bring one of our students back, and we visited the site, and there was no question what the youngster was academically able to do so. The concern that was unanimously agreed to was, would there be a structure or mechanism in place that would facilitate the youngster handling with his social behavioral types of issues? And specifically, would there be paraprofessional support to be with that youngster to prevent, any type of regression, especially to the point where it would interfere with the learning of other students. With respect to the professional learning, there is so much learned every day about the functioning of the brain, about what is the best way to interact with students with certain types of learning disabilities. We need to make sure that our certified and non-certified staff are up to speed on those things. It does become a priority with respect to expenditure, the budgeting and expenditure of funds, to make sure we have funding available. It might be, for example, does that become the priority, for example, of our Title II funds, which are federal funds that you can either use, for example, for class size reduction on one hand, or professional staff learning on the other. We're going to have to, hopefully these recommendations, if adopted, will become guidelines by which we'll make some of those types of decisions.
Bill, the only other thing I wanted to comment on is under other, we talked about reporting quarterly. So I do want to re-emphasize that would be part of your report, right, your recommendation, right?
If that's one of the things that the board, yeah, fine.
Okay.
I'll be honest, that wasn't one of the things I was thinking through when I developed this and when I spoke with folks.
I just want to emphasize that information will be included. As far as the needs assessment for professional learning for certified and non-certified personnel, my study of this subject has revealed that appears to be the weakest, the weak link, if you will, in the chain on special education. We will hire people, but we won't give them the training they need to fulfill the role in special education. And I'm glad to see that added here, because that's something that I think would go a long way toward improving what we're doing in that subject. If we at least give the individuals that we're entrusting the children that need the most support with some training to make them understand how it is they need to perform in that capacity.
I think the district has done relatively well in providing training. But research will show time and time again, there's a direct correlation to the level of professional learning and the level of student performance. I mean, it's almost a no-brainer. So I think it is something that we need to look at.
Any Any other comments from any other members of the board? Amy?
Yeah, on that last topic, are we talking about the training for regular ed teachers, or special ed teachers, or support staff, or all three?
You know, that's a very good question, and it should be all three.
I think so too.
It should be all three, yes.
That is one thing that we talked to Dr. Wu about, is the regular ed teacher having training to all kinds of
I've led
areas.
quite a few trainings in our building, but I haven't gone outside our building.
Good point, thank you.
Anyone else? Thank you very much, Phil, for that recommendation. We certainly believe that we should go forward now with this and give you the support that's necessary to implement it. Okay, there being no other comment on that topic at this point, we would now look toward item 9D, which is a report of the screening committee chairman regarding the superintendent search progress and timelines. We asked Chairman Reinhardt on the screening committee to provide us with just a general piece of information at this point, which is kind of related now that we have selected by lottery the participants and know the nature of the makeup of the committee. If you could share with us what the plan is, please.
I spoke with Kennedy Benedictus from NISDEC, who is the outfit we hired to help us with the search. He can't give me any idea at this point how many applicants we're going to have, so that still remains a big question. The search committee's meeting, the first meeting they have will be Wednesday, January 23rd at 6 o'clock. And Ken will be there that night to present how the schedule's going to go and what's expected of the people that are on the committee.
Where is that meeting being held?
It's going to be, I believe it's going to be here, isn't it?
Yes.
It'll be right here
At the high school.
on
At the
Wednesday,
Library
January
Media
23rd.
Center?
I'm not, probably will need one if we're gonna have 15 or 16 people total. Actually, maybe more than that, yeah, we'll probably need this space.
Okay. I would leave it up to you all to schedule it.
And other than that, there's really nothing to report at this point, because we're still really just beginning.
Okay, can you give a rough idea of the plan for February 4th through the 11th? The 11th is a regular school board meeting.
4th through the 11th is when this committee is going to whittle. Here again, we don't know how many applicants we're gonna have, but we need to whittle it down to 2 or 3 by the 16th and present them to the school board.
Or more, you might consider more.
Well, maybe. Ideally, we want to whittle them down to 3, I would think. And then it gets pretty intense after that also. We have the candidates visit the district between the 13th and the 15th. Then if the committee feels it's necessary, we're gonna visit the candidates' districts between the 18th and the 20th. And by the 25th, we're gonna need to select a superintendent. So the timeline for the first phase is like 7 days, so people on this committee need to know in those 7 days, we might have 7 meetings, depending on the number of applicants.
I do want to point out, that's all the town meeting,
Huh?
that's when all the town meetings are happening, all the
Well-
deliberative sessions.
That's life.
Yeah, it's gonna be crazy.
Yeah,
that's the
I have to
schedule.
be at deliberative session on the 6th for our town. I have to be there. We only have 2 supervisors because we have one in the hospital.
Well,
Well, logistically, you'll work that out. The thing we wanted to share this evening with everyone was that the timeline is tight, it's set up, and it is under execution at the present time, so.
and at the first meeting, we'll decide meeting dates and times that are agreeable to most. If some of the committee members don't think they can keep that schedule, then we're gonna ask them to step off. Because we need everybody there to make these decisions. It's important.
Any questions for Paul? Okay, thank you. All right, at this point in time, we will talk about the default budget, which is item 9E. Dan?
Included in your packet was a sheet titled Notes to Methodology for Creation of the FY14 Default Budget. In addition to the 8 steps taken to create that number, it listed, it gave you a chart summarizing the net results. The FY13 budget as was appropriated in March of 2012. The FY14 proposed at that point in time, which is what the school board has to date voted on as their proposed budget. A column for the variance between the two, so growth up or down could be seen by fund.
Where is that chart, Dan? Excuse me.
I'm sorry, I thought it was in your packet, but I can provide extra copies. Purple?
Oh, it's purple sheet.
Yep. Does anyone need a fresh copy?
Thank you.
Sure.
Forgot about it. I think it was white on Friday night.
Most likely it was. And so I believe the methodology is sound. I believe the methodology conforms to the legal requirements used and stated for constructing a default budget, as well as past practice in this district. And I'd be happy to take any questions anyone has about it, about the details or the thought process behind the methodology.
And the net difference between the school budget committee's number and the operating, the default budget now as it stands is?
Just over $300,000.
And the default budget is higher.
Correct?
I'm just trying to share some data with the folks that are going to be watching this on TV or listening to the audio. There is always a difference of opinion on what constitutes certain elements of the default budget versus the formula that's in the RSA, which is quite clear. That's why we oftentimes come up with different numbers here, so. This seems pretty straightforward to me.
So barring any further discussion or changes at the board's discretion to the default number, the two things I would ask that you consider the motion that I included in advance in your packet to accept that number if you find it acceptable, and whether you find that number acceptable or move to change it. I would ask that tonight you execute the Form MSDS, which is the board's default budget, which is one of the documents that gets posted no later than January 28th this year in all 7 towns. Similar to as I had I requested and received the budget committee signatures on Form MS-27, which is their proposed budget, which has to be posted in the same fashion. And I have that form prepared here. And I
Is
will
that
also,
something we put on a consent agenda, or do you want to move it separately?
I would like to vote on this separately. concerns or questions?
I just, because it's the first year with a tax cap, I just have to make sure I'm clear, we have this,
It's just so you're aware that the tax cap is relevant to this issue.
it's irrelevant.
Yeah,
Okay.
the tax cap is only relevant to the proposed budget. The budget committee brings to the first deliberative session.
Okay, so it's not relevant to default at all. Okay.
And to emphasize that point, it's not, also not relevant to, what the legislative body wants to do. Simply because the legislative body can do whatever it wants. The tax cap is a restriction that the school budget committee must by law live within. And if I may, that was where the crisis was. Because of that law, the way it was worded would have required the school budget committee to reduce their number by roughly another $900,000. Therein lies the crisis. They did not want to recommend a smaller number. We certainly didn't want to have to deal with that as a school board. And the simple reason was, we did not want to put that before the legislative body as a recommended number. That's all it was, that was the issue. But by law, that would have had to have occurred if it did not get changed. And the risk was that the legislative body may have voted to pass a $900,000 smaller budget. We, as both school board and school budget committee, did not want to take that risk. We wanted to recommend a budget that was $900,000 higher than that, and in order to do so, we had to change state law. The tax cap is not the issue that it is being made to be on social media. And what I am reading on the social media is factually incorrect.
Vincent, I think it's important people understand, we didn't want to add this money to the budget. We just didn't want to take it out of the budget.
Correct.
Because
Which
last
we would
year
have been
took-
forced to do. Good point. Any other clarity on the default budget? Any discussion? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to the annual report of the business administrator on computing philosophy and migration progress.
I have a question then, so the motion that Dan has made,
When we take up action items, that'll
Okay.
come up as item 12E. All of the items listed under 9E may or may not have, they will have corresponding numbers under item 12, which is action items. We want to hear from the public in between to maybe get some input that might influence a vote. We will take action on items starting with item 12A or not. We will, if there's no action necessary, we'll just record that fact. Or the stuff that's on the consent agenda will just get passed all at once. Does that help? Okay. Dan, could you address item 9F for us, please?
Yes. On July 14th, 2008, the school board adopted its computing philosophy, which in essence spoke to the types of computers, specifically the configuration of the operating systems and the basis of the computers that the district would have available in its inventory of computing assets. I'd like to point out, just by way of example, the intent was for the district's computing ability or assets to mirror the market image, what was termed the market image at that point in time. So by way of example, if we believe the world market was 90% PCs and 10% proprietary operating systems, our computers we should work towards, at a ratio of about 20% a year, we should work towards mirroring that image on an annual basis. And specifically in the philosophy, it talked of reaching the goal no later than the start of the 2013 fiscal year, which is what we're in right now. there's also provisions for adjusting this based on budgetary requirements and availability, et cetera. I think it's important, so at the time, the district was heavily dependent on proprietary operating systems and less dependent on computers that could be competitively bid. I think it's important to recognize that at the time philosophy was adopted, the tablet industry hadn't really come to the point where it is now. iPads hadn't proliferated in the marketplace and the school place as they have to a certain extent now. And other operating systems, for example, Chrome is an operating system that we currently use on a number of computers. And while that's a proprietary system, I don't think anyone can argue the cost effectiveness, which was part of the intent of being able to competitively bid computers, was cost effectiveness, and certainly the cost effectiveness of the assets that use this Chrome operating system, or what we refer to as Chromebooks, was not contemplated at that time either. That being said, I'd like to give some data, hard data, on where we currently stand as a district from computing resources. We currently have 851 assets. I would suggest fall within the typical discussion of this philosophy. And so everyone knows the breakout. We have 448 assets running a Windows operating system of some sort. We have 205 assets running what I'll term an Apple or Mac operating system. We have 11 assets which operate under a Linux operating system. We have 63 of these devices I referred to as Chromebooks, and we have 124 iPads. So for example, if we were to take the tablets out of that discussion and just talk about, or the iPads out of that discussion, just talk about laptops and desktops and servers, 61% of those devices are running Windows operating systems, 28% are running proprietary Apple operating systems, and 11% are running other. So I think we've made a dramatic strides, if not completion of the philosophy. By the start of this current school year, we've come very far. If we were to include all the assets I discussed, 53% are running Windows operating systems, 24% running Mac systems, 1% on Linux systems, 7% on Chromebook systems, and 14% on iPads. And I think to really, and maybe I will apologize for not doing more background work on this project for tonight's presentation, but I think one of the things we need to evaluate is I think the marketplace has also changed dramatically. When we first accepted this philosophy, when the board first adopted this philosophy 5 years ago, I think proprietary systems were probably a much smaller percentage of the world marketplace than they are now. And I think for my next report, whether it be a year from now or 3 months from now or whatever, we should probably try and do some research about what the current, because the philosophy speaks to mirroring the market profile, we should probably better understand what the current market profile is, and then recompare our profile to the market profile. And if we can, maybe take that as a note towards the next time this annual report is due, that would be my preference. There are other things we're working on, but certainly when the board sees fit from having a report back on this subject, I will.
Any questions for Dan?
No, I just agree with what you just said, though. You have to constantly be reevaluating.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.
Just while we're on the subject, I'll just throw one, because we meet in this room, the next step we are moving towards is the PC devices that are in this room, not the proprietary devices that are in that alcove, but the PC devices that form the perimeter of this room are shortly going to be replaced with devices that use the the Chrome operating system. But instead of Chromebooks, because we're concerned about the screen size and the teacher who operates this room, her ability to monitor what the students are working on, it'll be what's called a Chrome box, which will basically be a small form factor desktop with a full-size screen, but using the Chrome operating system, which enables the students to access all their Google Docs and internet for research, etc. that might happen before your next full meeting.
Where will these go?
Those will get redeployed throughout the district to reduce the age of other systems that are operating within the district currently, because these aren't as old as many other computers we have,
How does the price compare?
very favorably. We're paying under $300 per asset for the Chrome operating system new, and that includes a full, is there a 4 or 5 year? I think it's a 4-year warranty.
I think control over that technology situation has come a long way in the past few years. I thank you for your effort on that. Any questions? Okay, moving on to item 9G. This is a discussion of possible warrant articles to retain a fund balance and finalize the warrant. Now, it's related to 9H as well, in the sense that once we decide what the warrant will look like in its final form, we will assign individuals on the board to speak towards it. One exception on this procedure this evening is at the Budget Committee hearing, I invited Archie Ogier to attend the meeting here with us this evening, and he agreed to do so. He has an alternative perspective on adding what would be Article 4, limited fund balance retention. And I'd like to hear our discussion on that and what Mr. Ogier may have to say in contrast before we decide whether to put it on there. You'll notice the big words in letters that say draft on here. That's what this is. This was presented at the Budget Committee on Friday evening, the Budget Committee hearing. And there's a few things on here that needed to be corrected. It says, for example, under Article 4, the school board recommends this article. That's not really quite true. This is something that I put forward for the board to consider at this meeting this evening for purposes of discussing this particular new law that allows us to retain a fund balance. So that's the nature of this discussion under 9G. One of the other possibilities that we want to talk about this evening is the sequence of articles. And my personal preference on the operating budget is to make that article last, which you'll note we've done in the past. And I would like to consider taking that action to rearrange the articles accordingly to make the operating budget last. My reasoning for that is that the individuals that show up at the legislative meeting, the deliberative session, which is scheduled for February 2nd, not just be there to show up and vote up or down on the operating budget or modify it or whatever, but to hear the discussion and all of the conversation, if you will, that takes place on all the other articles before they leave. That's my rationale behind it. So, I would throw
Excuse me,
things-
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I think there was one other item that we discussed relative to the warrant, and that was the possible inclusion of an article following what's currently listed as Article 3.
Yes.
And I'd be speaking to that.
Yes.
With your approval.
This is now the time to actually mention that, Bill, if you would, and we would add that, for lack of a better way to term it at this point, on the paperwork that we have before us, it would be inserted between Article 3 and 4 if we did it. So for purposes of discussion, we'll call it Article 3B.
Fine, okay.
Okay. Dan, if we could start with some commentary from you on fund balance retention, which is new to school districts under RSA 198 this year.
Sure. This is, there's new legislation passed in August of 2012 that authorizes the legislative body to empower the school district to retain a portion of a fund balance. Currently, as I think we all are aware, school districts, unlike towns and counties and cities, cannot retain any portion of a fund balance. It is all go into the next year's funds to reduce taxes. What this, with the legislative body were to pass this article, the school board could then, at the school board's discretion, retain an amount of an existing fund balance up to 2.5% of the local taxation for that year. And before I give examples of numbers, let me be clear that the number needs, because local taxation changes each year, the amount that can be held in this account changes each year. It is not 2.5% per year that continues to accrue, so after 4 years you would have 10%, for example. It is a fixed amount of 2.5% that can be retained in this account that needs to be recalculated each year, and it's up to 2.5%. So, for example,
Which for this year would be?
this year would be approximately $225,000, based on the fact that we had about $11 million in local taxation, and we had a fund, so for example, this year a $700,000 unreserved fund balance was declared and audited. That money was entirely used to reduce the taxation locally for the appropriation of the current year that was approved last March. The school board, if we had been on this curve a year earlier, the school board could have made the decision to reserve approximately up to approximately $225,000 of that $700,000 fund balance, which would sit and remain with the district, not be included in the calculation to reduce taxes for the current year, and could be spent for unanticipated expenses with a process. There's a process such as, that includes, for example, petitioning the DOE. The school board would have to petition the DOE for approval to spend this money. But it would enable the school board to hold on to this money, and after the process is approved, not just the process of empowering the school board, but once, if it were all to happen, and the school board were to make this decision to retain the fund balance, and an unanticipated expense were to come up, rather than have a special meeting and raise the money through additional taxation, the school board could have the special meeting and or petition the school board, the Department of Education, and then just use the funds available in this special fund to handle the expense of that unanticipated or emergency expenditure. Is that clear?
When you say special meeting,
Mm-hmm.
did we agree that that was a meeting of the school board?
Correct. Yeah, I mean,
Not a special district
yeah,
meeting?
not a district-wide
Big
meeting.
difference.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. The school board would have to hold a meeting to discuss the subject, which I assume they would only do once they received approval from the Department of Education, and thereby expend those funds on the unanticipated expense without raising additional local taxes, because they would have the cash available to them in this account.
Now, could you speak also to the ongoing implication of what that would mean, say, year to year?
Sure. Each year, the school board could reevaluate whether to keep the money in the fund, or, for example, if there were a need in a specific year for an expense that was unanticipated but seen in advance, the school board could choose to include that number of it for the cost of that expense in the appropriation, and then add this money to any fund balance to reduce the tax impact of that additional appropriation through the regular process to keep taxes level and smooth.
So I just want to ask a question. So that means if you manage to save money during the year, as you did this year, you would be able to save some, right?
Would
Like
be,
hold
yeah,
some of it in our accounts
Yeah.
instead of returning it.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to make sure I understand what you just said, though. First, you said we can't accumulate that like toward 10% over
Correct.
4 years.
It's recalculated each year, the 2.5% number.
Can that money can't still be sitting there the following June 30th?
It can be, but if, for example, let's say we take the example of the past 2 years. Let's say we'd had this tool available 2 years ago, and we retained 2.5% of the $13.5 million that was raised last year. But this year, we only raised $11.5 million. We would have had to reduce the amount in that fund, and we would be forced to return at least a portion of it, so that the amount in it would still only be 2.5% of local taxation. Because local taxation dropped so dramatically,
Okay.
there would have to be a equal-wise percentage drop in the amount that's allowed to be kept in this fund. Is that a clear example? And so if the goal was to keep taxes, local taxation, so to go back to my previous example, if the goal were to be to keep local taxes flat, but you know you had a certain expenditure that was above what you were able to reduce your other offsets, you could use this fund to reduce the amount of local taxation because of an increase in expenses to keep it flat. It can be used, it's a tool. It's a tool that I see as being very helpful for smoothing out the curves and dealing with unexpected situations.
Right. And in cases where there's a substantial fund balance, and help me articulate this, Dan, I'm thinking that when that goes away and that credit that we choose to give back to the taxpayers is now no longer in the formula, what happens is that puts a greater impact when the tax rate is set, because the credit for $20,000 will say for each town, or the town of Bristol, or the town of Alexandria, whatever it is that got apportioned that amount for that month, the town would have to make up and change its tax rate to accumulate that money and then pay to the school district. So when credits go back to the school, to the town, and they're really large, it's not such a good thing when it's no longer there. This is a tool that would allow us to smooth that out, as Dan said. And for those folks who are opposed to keeping the tax cap in place, I would recommend that they consider evaluating whether having a fund balance isn't a better way to give us the insurance policy, if you will, to hold out, in our case, which would be around $225,000, on a separate sum for purposes of use in an emergency. This does not preclude our ability to have the maintenance fund as well.
Correct.
Which will in fact, if it is passed, go toward the amount of money that we set aside, which has usually been $60,000, that will accrue.
That goes each year that warrant article is approved and there is a fund balance, that money goes into that account. And that is designated for a very specific purpose.
Right.
Building issues that are unanticipated and significant.
Right.
I have a question for, I think, both Phil and Dan. And so either one of you can answer based on your experiences. What kinds of emergencies come up? I know some, but in your experiences, what kind of?
Well, I think that the two that I would point to, and I don't mean to speak for you, but the two that I would point to would either be facility structural issues, a roof caves in, and it's not an insured event, which, crazy things happen, or a fuel tank. There's an issue that needs to be dealt with. I mean, next year one of the things we're gonna deal with next year is the replacement of this fuel tank out here for regulations, but if it ruptured early, we'd have to deal with it. Or a special ed issue. We do have a special ed contingency fund, however.
An unforeseen special ed issue.
Yeah, thank you. An unforeseen special ed issue. A family moves into the district with heavy needs, and that hasn't been budgeted for. We have legal requirements to deal with these needs, and there have been times in the past where we've had to make dramatic and significant unexpected cuts to other areas of the budget to support these needs, and something else suffers if you're doing that, and I can see the judgment in that too. But if you want to maintain a consistency of programming and deal with the unexpected in a transparent, we're always be in a transparent way, as transparent as you can be with those issues, this would be a tool for that.
If I may, Bill, the only other thing that I've run into in recent years is on occasion, because of how the state funds what it funds, on occasion you'll get a change in the state's position mid-year and you haven't budgeted for that. The best example I could give of that is around the vocational education piece. I think last year, at Interlakes, we were looking at the possibility of $150,000 shortfall that we were gonna have to come up with. Because when the state identifies how much money they're going to give in support of tuition transportation for vocational education, that's how the time frame in which it works out. That might be another example.
Don?
And the 2.5% that's being set by the future legislation.
No, what this legislation says is that the school board can pick any number it wants up to 2.5% of your local taxation. So you wouldn't have to reserve the whole 2.5%. You could say, you know what, we've got this much fund balance, let's put this dollar figure, which is less than 2.5%, so it falls within the threshold, into the fund, and let's return the balance right away.
But that 2.5% max is being set
It is in the
by
legislation,
state
correct?
legislation.
That's the max we can go to. One other point on that is if in the subsequent year, when it comes time to calculate what that number would be, if 2.5% yields a number higher, then that difference of say $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, whatever it may be, would have to be part of the fund balance that would go back to the towns. Okay, so we're restricted. It's a I don't want to call it a rainy day fund, but I'd like you to think it like that, for emergency purposes, that is highly regulated under the RSA, very highly regulated.
Can this language be changed at all in this article at this point?
No, I don't believe it can. I believe that's the language that's dictated in the RSA to be used.
Okay, the reason I ask is because the sentence that says for emergency expenditures and over expenditures is going to be problematic to voters, because emergency expenditures are one thing, but if it doesn't say emergency over expenditures, do you know what I mean? They're going to say, oh, you just spent more than you should have, and we're not going to pay for that.
Let me address that with a comment from Gordon Graham, who is of Sol Leslie Kidder, Saywood and Lowman, which is our district's law firm. In a paper that Dan provided me, where he attended a conference in September regarding the matter, it addresses that language very explicitly. Part 1 of the uses of the retained fund balance. Usual circumstances requiring an expenditure. He says, RS 3211 is entitled Emergency Expenditures and Over Expenditures. Its title is somewhat misleading because it provides that when an unusual circumstance arises during the year which makes it necessary to expend money in excess of an appropriation, which may result in an over expenditure of the total amount appropriated for all purposes at the meeting, or when no appropriation has been made, the school board, upon application to the commissioner of the Department of Education, may be given authority to make the expenditure, provided that, and then there's a whole host of requirements that have to be met. An application for the expenditure is made prior to making the expenditure, and if there is a budget committee, that the application is made after the budget committee has approved the application in writing. Permission may be granted to expend funds after the fact that the expenditure was caused by a sudden or unexpected emergency. The commissioner cannot approve the expenditure unless the school board designates the source of the revenue to be used. The district must send a copy of its application to the commissioner in the Department of Education. And the Department of Education must notify the Department of Revenue if the request is granted. My point being that there are a host of technical requirements that would have to be met for us to be able to use this money. Now, with that said, if there are other questions, I'd like to entertain them from the board at this point. The plan is, for your consideration to take action on this, is to include this article in the warrant if you so feel it's a good idea. I would submit to you that a combination of things that have happened in this district make it prudent, in my opinion, to add this arrow into our quiver for financial management purposes. a number of things that are in place, not the least of which is currently the tax cap, which severely restricts the budget committee, the school budget committee, from presenting a budget beyond that which is more than 2.5% of the taxes raised in the prior year. The fact that we have significantly reduced the budget in the first place by getting what we thought, at least in prior years, needed to be gotten under control, and eliminated positions, and are now tweaking the use of those funds to manage the district where it needs to be managed properly so that class size is reasonable and not out of control. This is yet another tool that the legislature put forth for us to consider, and that's why I'm putting it before the board to consider putting it before the deliberative session. At this point, I would like to ask Mr. Ogier, if he would, to speak on what he would consider to be his opinion on this, which I believe is in opposition to implementing. So I'd like you to hear both sides of this, and I think Archie's well qualified to speak to it. Would you?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Arch.
It'll perhaps be a little disjointed in terms of my speaking to you about this, because I really did not prepare any specific notes with respect to this issue. However, be that the case, let's see what we can come up with. New Pound's operated about 50 years now, since 1963. So we've got a pretty good record of managing the funds, our fiscal arrangements over that 50-year period without this new legislation. Now, how in the world were we able to do that? And as a matter of fact, the current administration has managed the funds quite well and has even made it possible to turn back $700,000 to the towns. That is a very nice return for the towns and a great advantage to what they can do with respect to the tax rate. I was very pleased when I got my tax bill and I saw that my school tax went down dramatically, as a matter of fact. I'll be the first to say, having been in sort of a situation like Dan, where I had a thing to do with operating the school budget, that's a very nice cushion to have available to you. But, as your chair pointed out, there are ways to handle emergencies at this point without having that new legislation. And it's RSA 3211, which he quoted to you. And that's not such a dreadful process. As a selectman, I got involved with the community of Bristol and have had experience with emergency situations, and it's not that bad. There are ways around it. And as a matter of fact, I wonder, I think, what do we have? Maybe 40 cooperative districts or something like that. They weren't able to have this kind of cushion, and they've survived too. And I guess my point is, part of my point is, don't add additional layers of how to deal with the financial aspect. If the system you have works, use it and don't play with it. Now, one of the examples that was given to you with respect to, well, where would we use this? One example was special needs kits. You already got that in your budget. You got a $150,000 contingency to handle that very case, already budgeted. Okay? Now, do you need another $200,000? I don't think so. If you do, there is a process where you can cover that. I really don't think it's something that you ought to adopt as a board. I think you're keeping excellent faith with each of the 7 towns every time you turn money back to the towns. If you think you're hurting for money, towns are as well. Matter of fact, there's one town that can't even meet its monthly payments. Sorry.
Or you
I
may choose to
I
put it on
couldn't
schedule.
resist putting that in there. But that does seem to be an issue with some of the towns. Now, if you give them back the money, maybe that will help. I really don't think it's something we need, and I'd say to encourage you, don't put it in. You don't need it.
Thank you, Arch.
You're welcome.
I appreciate that input. Thank you for coming this evening, and I'm sure we'll see you at the deliberative session.
I suspect so.
One of the reasons I wanted to consider it and have you all think about putting it on the warrant is it would not take place if it were passed until the end of this upcoming fiscal year. So the calculation that would be made at that time would be limited to the percentage we chose. We've selected 2.5% because that seems to be the number that we work with this year on the tax cap. I feel that it should be left up to the legislative body to decide whether this is an additional tool that should be put in our quiver, and let the people that attend the session discuss it, consider the merits, the lack of merit, and then to decide whether or not the voters on the polls, at the polls on March 12th, I believe it is, will in fact pass it or not. It's related, if you will, toward the progress that we made in Article 3, which is the teachers' agreement, where they have agreed to reduce the contribution of the district from 90% to 87% of their health care expense. That is a step in the right direction, and all of these things combined will give us better fiscal management and control of something that has hitherto been out of control, and which was what brought us to the choice we had to make this past spring. I'm advocating that we consider this and implement it on the warrant for that reason. Is there further discussion on this particular article, article number 4, as it currently exists? Any question? Okay, hearing none, we are proposing an expendable trust fund, Article 5, for building maintenance. Is there discussion on inclusion of this particular warrant article? Okay, hearing none, on Article 6, this is a petition warrant article by a group of individuals, voters, that have passed muster, and it is a completely legitimate petitioned article and shall be considered by the deliberative session and put on the ballot. It'll probably be discussed at the meeting. Really no question there. If someone wanted to make a statement on it this evening, now would be the time to do so.
I have a couple of things. It says passage requires a 3/5 majority ballot vote.
Yes,
Did the original tax cap?
yes,
Okay, so it has to be done the same way?
yes.
Okay. I guess I should address a comment made online. I'll no longer be participating online in these conversations because they're getting too negative, but somebody made a comment online that the board adamantly, and the budget committee adamantly opposed this article, and I said that would be untrue. So nobody asked me if I adamantly opposed it, and I don't. I didn't support the tax cap. I think it's up to the voters to decide, but I just thought that we had a conservative board elected, and that the budget had already been cut dramatically, and that there was no need to add sort of insult to injury by setting a tax cap on the district as well, when I thought they already had done a lot to change the budget. So, there you have it.
Okay, thank you for that. As far as that goes, I refer you back to comments from Dr. Ross herself, which, right in the middle of this, she says repeatedly, please check the facts for yourself. Please call anytime you would like to check out the facts for yourself. And so for that reason, as you can see this evening, statements that are being made that both the Budget Committee and the school board adamantly oppose Article 6 haven't even discussed it yet. And we have made no decision one way or the other. Okay, working backwards to what would be Article 1 is certainly just to select officials for the ensuing year. That'll be dealt with in a moment. Article 2 is the operating budget. And this number has been altered by the school budget committee.
It has.
Okay, and you should know that that number is changed
It's down 40,919.
because it needs to be recommended under the tax cap. And that's where that is.
May I speak to that?
Please.
Specifically, the tax cap details, deals with all warrant articles the Budget Committee recommends. The Budget Committee voted to support and recommend what is on this document as Article 3, which is the teacher's contract. So, with the Budget Committee supporting and recommending the teacher's contract be passed, it gets added into the total amount with which they can legally recommend as an appropriation. Therefore, they took the action to reduce their proposed budget by $40,919, so that when you added the operating budget being recommended by the Budget Committee, plus the teacher's article, the teacher's contract article being recommended by the Budget Committee, they combine to be within the law of the tax cap at 2%.
Thank you. So our recommended number at this point differs with the budget committee by that amount. And we'll see what the voters choose to give us. Now, again, I'm going to ask, when we take action on this, to make the operating budget the last article on the warrant. I don't need to repeat the reasons why. That leaves for us at this point Article 3, which is the teacher's contract agreement, which the board unanimously supports, and will speak toward talking about the cost savings for the district that will accrue if in fact this passes. Again, another tool for long-range prudent fiscal management for this school board to move forward with. Coupled with that, we are proposing that an additional article be included along the same lines, which will signify our committed support toward passage of Article 3. And I'd like to ask Dr. McCormick to speak to that in a moment. But just for clarification purposes, the warrant as built by the school board, without the petition warrant article, gives us additional tools to move forward with prudent fiscal management in this district. The addition of the article that Dr. McCormick will speak about shows the commitment that the school board has, assuming we do add it after our discussion, toward passage of Article 3, which is the contract with the teachers. Bill?
Thank you. What's coming around to the board is, and I'll read it, at this point it's Article 3B. Shall the district, if Article 3 is defeated, authorize the Newfound Area School District School Board to call one special meeting at its option to address Article 3 cost items only. And as Mr. Migliori states, this, first of all, I would say, it really is a way to show public support by the board of the teacher agreement, because probably, I'd say at least 10 years ago, legislation was passed that allowed school districts to put this article on the warrant. And it partially, I believe, sprang from the fact that it's very difficult, you have to go through the courts to get a special district meeting. What this does is allow, if for example, and in our case, I'll make the comment, it would be unfortunate if the agreement does not pass, but should it not pass, And the two sides then, as a matter of course, would get back together to see if they could come in with, there may be some specific things spoken to that they would identify, that were identified during the first deliberative session, and both sides could come back and talk that over, and you might be able to reach yet a second different agreement. If you don't have this article on your warrant, you are somewhat, you are prohibited from revisiting it until the following year, unless you get court approval for a special district meeting. And usually they don't give that for anything less than an emergency situation. It is difficult to get. I did pass this by the school's attorney that helped with the negotiation process. He said, oh yes, as a matter of fact, oh yes, that should be included. Because I think that is the norm and what happens certainly in most districts. It has happened in the last 9 districts that I've worked in over the last 15 plus years. So that would be the intent of this article. It would become Article 4, and then Article 4 would become Article 5, and so on. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Let's append a name to this. We'll call this, just for purposes of discussion, the NADA support article.
Okay.
Okay? Because when we reorder these, I would like to assign them, speaking assignment-wise,
Yep.
by name, not by number, because they will be reordered. Okay, Sue?
So you don't need court approval if you do it this way?
Correct.
This is something that has not been done in the New Farm District in the past, to my knowledge.
Right, we have had a special meeting because a teacher contract was voted down and it was approved by the